Before any of this,
Shh, keep it confidential, keep it confidential.
the stars were rich, gorgeous, and famous. Of course they misbehaved, wouldn't you? In a lot of ways, nothing's changed.
This world will last forever.
Keep it confidential, keep it confidential.
Mr. Confidential.
Once you opened the door to telling these kinds of stories about the true lives of these people, and make no mistake, if it was a scandalous article, it was the truth. The reason that it changed our culture, though, was not just that people wanted to read those stories, but that the studios and the actors involved, as much as they protested, I think they began to realize that, the axiom that there is no such thing as bad publicity.
Hollywood in the 30s and 40s was very much a company town. It was a small town. There was not a lot for people to do. There were a few nightclubs, but the social life, Hollywood celebrities' social lives revolved around house parties. People had parties all the time. This was a way to socialize, but also to be somewhat protected because you weren't out in the public getting drunk or having peccadillos or making a fool of yourself. Unless, of course, you happened to be at a party with Luella Parsons or Hedda Hopper. Then you truly had to be on your guard because they were working, they weren't guests, and anything that you said and they overheard could very well end up in the columns the very next day. That's why Bob Hope said their columns were the first thing we read every morning, probably to find out what happened at that party they were at that they didn't know that happened. Reached a fever pitch, or had its very beginnings with those two women, with Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. They really whetted our appetite for Hollywood gossip, and it continues to this day.
Hello, everybody. It's Hedda Hopper reporting to you from Hollywood, that fabulous place where everyone wants to live but seldom does. Hollywood, whose celebrities were discovered in Centerville, who live in Beverly Hills, work in Culver City, and play in Palm Springs.
When filmmaking begins in earnest in the early 1900s in America, what studio owners very quickly ascertain is they will not give power to the actors. So they don't let the names of the actors appear on the screen. There's no credits. Mary Pickford, who becomes one of the biggest early stars, is known as Little Mary because that's her character in a variety of films. The public, as early as 1910, 1911, wants to know about these stars. So one of the things that happens is in 1912, Photoplay becomes the first popular movie magazine. That spawns an entire industry of film magazines. People want to know about these stars. So there are these gossipy columns in each of these now growing movie magazines that seem to be feeding this insatiable appetite of the public to learn about these stars. When Photoplay begins in 1912, it's almost exclusively a print magazine. It tells you the stories of what the movie is. Within 4 years, there's very little print in Photoplay. It's almost all pictures, and it's telling you all about the supposed off-screen life of the stars. Now, from the beginning, the movie makers are shoveling the story of what they want people to believe about these actors and actresses. But the public's appetite for news of these stars, who they feel they know, because they can go around the corner and put a quarter down and go into a theater and see them bigger than life on the screen. They feel like they know these stars. They want to know more and more and more. So one of the results of this is in newspapers trying to catch up and keep a pace, Luella Parsons, who begins as a screenwriter, she's a very savvy publicist from the beginning. She writes a book about how to write stories for the movies and gets herself set apart from the others by doing that. She then decides she's going to go to New York and make her mark there. And she does, and she works for several different newspapers at the time with columns about the movies. And one of the people that she attaches herself to is Marion Davies. She knows Marion Davies before she knows William Randolph Hearst. Now, of course, she knows that Marion Davies is the favorite of William Randolph Hearst at the time. Well, after about a year of friendship with Marion introduces her to Hearst. And Hearst at the time owns dozens of newspapers, in addition to his movie studio, and he's come to power in movies primarily to promote Marion Davies. She's one of the most powerful media barons at the time in the country. And yet he meets this woman, Luella Parsons, who challenges him. And people don't usually challenge William Randolph Hearst. But he finds this intriguing, offers her a job, and she takes it. And through her friendship with Hearst, her support of Hearst, she is able to build up an incredible following, and she's syndicated in all of his newspapers. So Luella Parsons, starting really in the early 1920s, is building herself up as the one who tells the public about their favorite stars. In the 20s, there's dozens and dozens of filmmaking companies. Because of the Depression, because of talkies coming in, Wall Street coming in, people, frankly, who didn't know about movie making, taking them over. Almost every studio in 1933 was operating in the red. All of a sudden, we wake up in 1934, there are a total of 7 studios working in Los Angeles. So through mergers, buyouts, and just plain bankruptcies, the business of movie making has changed drastically in the early 30s. So with that as the new plateau, studios become almost mini cities on their own, including with their own police forces, including with their own enforcers. If a star gets in trouble, they know which DA to bribe. Hearst and Luella didn't have to bribe people. People at the studios did, to protect their own. And this is also at a time when in the early 1920s, there was a real crisis in Hollywood, a real crisis.
Just gone through a series of scandals which nearly brought the film industry down. There was the Fatty Arbuckle scandal, the William Desmond Taylor scandal, the Wallace Reed drug scandal. And Hollywood really came close to extinction.
This scares the filmmakers to death. They are so petrified that they go hat in hand to Will Hayes and ask him to be their czar, the morality czar. Please save us from ourselves. You have to help us save movie making. And for $100,000 a year, he agrees to do just that. By 1933, the uproar has been such over what films are saying and doing, and are they promoting immorality, that finally what becomes known as the Hays Code is put into effect.
So there was a new morality in the air of rigid conformity to the moral values of the United States, to goodness, to purity. And Luella certainly ran with that and capitalized on that. There were morality clauses put into stars' contracts at this time that their behavior had to be above reproach. Otherwise, they could be out at a moment's notice.
It doesn't have to be true. It just says, if stories of your immorality are printed in the newspaper, we can fire you. And these are for stars. Gloria Swanson's making $10,000 a week. If one newspaper says one thing about her, having an affair with somebody somewhere, she could be fired. I mean, this is this sort of Damocles held out over everybody's head, so they're petrified. So that alone keeps a lot of people under control to a point. It also makes people like Hedda and Luella all the more powerful, not because of anything Hedda and Luella do, but because of the fear that is permeating Hollywood. And if they feel like they have protectors in either Hedda or Luella, their career will be much smoother going.
There are just thousands and thousands of people here at this fantastic opening at the Pantages Theater. It's a real pleasure to bring our First Lady of the Press, radio, and all the rest of it that goes with Luella Parsons' wonderful title. Luella, welcome here as the first guest.
Thank you very much, George. We won't talk because you have so many wonderful stars waiting to get into this so wonderful picture.
Luella, you don't have to talk very much. everything you say that's great and important is read by millions. So thank you very much for being so understanding. Bye-bye.
Luella Parsons was called the Queen of Hollywood because of the power of William Randolph Hearst's newspapers. I mean, she appeared in over 400 newspapers in over 20 cities worldwide. So people read every day what Luella wrote. And her power became overwhelming in Hollywood because of the power of the press, basically. People, celebrities in particular, movie stars at the time, were terrified. Not really of a bad mention in Luella's column, but of the silence. Luella ruled with silence. If she wasn't happy with you, you didn't get mentioned. And if you didn't get mentioned, your film didn't get mentioned. And if your film didn't get mentioned, then Louis B. Mayer and Harry Cohn and Jack Warner were not happy. So it was at your best interest to please Luella so you got a favorable mention in her column so your film would be mentioned, so your bosses would be happy and you could keep your fabulous movie star life.
With the latest Woodbury Hollywood headlines is Luella Parsons.
Hello to all of you from Hollywood, my first exclusive. Judy Garland will be off the screen indefinitely. She is desperately ill following her complete collapse Friday. Judy had a narrow escape from an overdose of sleeping pills.
This was a time when people were fascinated by Hollywood celebrities. We had no royalty in this country. This was our royalty. People wanted to aspire to be them. It was the Depression. People were looking for an escape. And Luella provided them at movie premieres, with interviews on the radio in particular. Her power truly grew when she was on the radio, with an escape. So it was almost like a populist movement behind her. People were fascinated with these stars, and Luella was the link between the common people and the celebrity. Luella, who sounded a lot like your aunt or your grandmother, would talk to these celebrities and get them to confess, their dreams, their desires, their fears. So when people listened to them, they could identify with them. So she was really the link. And for a long time, she was the only game in town.
Well, here's to you, Luella.
Here's to you.
Oh, don't drink it in tea, it's bad luck.
I never drink anything stronger.
What do you think of this star system?
If you took people and built them, exploited them, and developed them, as they did with Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, Norma Shearer, Marion Davies, Janet Gaynor, Ruth Chatterton, all of those young women.
You mean by signing them up, putting them under contract, and publicizing them?
Well, I think people shop for stars.
Luella Parsons was the premier columnist. And of course, the studios fed her the information. Usually it was accurate. But she would pick and choose who her favorites were. She would have parties every week and they would come courting her. So it was in their interest to promote their stars, to promote their next movies. And Luella was an obvious way to do that. There were abundance of others, but Luella had the power to be nationwide because of being syndicated. And so the publicists at different studios would particularly pay homage to her and take care of her and make sure that she had whatever she needed. She became known as the First Lady of Hollywood because she promoted herself as someone who was close to everyone.
There's the King of Hollywood, Douglas Fairbanks Sr. And wherever you saw the king, you were bound to see the queen, Mary Pickford, with Luella Parsons.
Luella loves her scoops, and she is able to get scoops. So she not only has her column, but in 1933, for instance, Mary Pickford has lunch with her and Frances Marion and tells Luella that yes, she and Douglas Fairbanks are planning on divorcing. She's going to divorce Douglas Fairbanks. Luella headlines every Hearst newspaper the next day. I mean headlines. So there's her name on the front page. Luella loves being on the front page. And she does that on several occasions. But she's a news hound in many ways. I mean, she starts as a legitimate reporter and a writer, but she now combines her reporting with her storytelling and promotes herself as what she will call the gay illiterate. Sort of like Amy Schumer now, the power of her comedy is she makes fun of herself before anybody else can. Luella Parsons made a habit of that throughout her life.
Here's Hollywood, the glamour and beauty, the romance and rhythm, the thrills and fun of movie land.
Darling, this is Luella Parsons.
Oh, how do you do?
Hello, baby.
I'm just crazy about your column. Sure wish I could read.
She's such a shy little thing. Of course, Daddy, my father, has kept her in school most of her life. She simply adores languages. Now say something in algebra, dear.
The best way to stay in Luella Parsons' good graces was to give her a scoop. She had a saying, you tell it to Luella first. And as long as you got the story to her first before anybody else, she was pretty protective of you, and she would make sure that you were seen in the proper light. However, if you didn't give her the story and somebody else broke the story first, then you could be in a great deal of trouble. One of the most famous examples was when Clark Gable and Carole Lombard got married. They promised Luella that she would have the scoop when they eloped and got married. Well, she didn't get it, and Luella was not happy. She held that grudge for the rest of Clark Gable's life, even after she was made Clark Gable's only child's godmother, long after Carole Lombard had died. She still wasn't too pleased with Clark Gable for letting that scoop slip by her.
At St. Cyril's Roman Catholic Church in Encino, California, celebrities like Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper are on hand for an auspicious camera debut, as is Jack Benny and his wife. What is the attraction that draws Marilyn Monroe and everybody? Well, it's young John Clark Gable, as he'll be known from today, the posthumous son of the famous actor. It's his baptismal day, and his proud mother is saddened by the fact that John's father never lived to see his offspring. A brilliant debut for young Gable, who steals the show on his very first public appearance.
In 1942, a film was being made that was the talk of Hollywood called Citizen Kane, being made by this wonderkind from New York, Orson Welles. Not a lot was known about Citizen Kane, but Luella managed to get a sneak peek, and what she saw horrified her. She thought for sure that the part that Citizen Kane, Charles Foster Kane, was just a thinly veiled version of her boss, William Randolph Hearst. She immediately alerted William Randolph Hearst to this and convinced him to wage an all-out war on this film, Citizen Kane, because it was so damaging to he and to his mistress, Marion Davies. To boycott all advertisements of the film, to basically run the film down in her column, and to make sure that it never saw the light of day, which of course it did. It was released, but it was nowhere near as effective because of the really aggressive campaign that William Randolph Hearst ran against the film at the behest of Luella Parsons. She also got Louis B. Mayer, got Jack Warner, got all of the studio heads to also go against this film, which is now considered to be, if not the greatest, certainly one of the greatest films of all time. But at that time, Citizen Kane was persona non grata in Hollywood.
Give me a mic. Thank you. How do you do, ladies and gentlemen? This is Orson Welles.
So Luella was pretty much omnipotent in the mid-30s, and her power was becoming pretty overwhelming. She began to meddle in business dealings of the studios. She could affect box office of films. If she didn't like if a star, she felt slighted by a star. If she felt slighted by a studio, she simply wouldn't mention a film that was in release, and box office receipts would plummet. So the studio executives were getting very nervous about the power that this little diminutive woman held over them. And they decided that there had to be a way to keep that power in check. Louis B. Mayer decided that the best way to do it would be to create a rival columnist, namely Hedda Hopper.
Yesterday I had a grand surprise. I was snooping around hot on the trail of a story when suddenly I heard some fascinating music. Curiosity may have killed a cat, but it certainly keeps columnists alive. So in I went.
Hedda Hopper was an actress. She had been in over 120 films from the silent era on. She was a very patrician, the yin to Luella Parsons' yang, if you will. They were total polar opposites in appearance and in demeanor. Hopper had an air of authority, had an air of almost a haughtiness about her. Whereas Luella was your aunt or your grandmother, motherly, lethal, but motherly. When the moguls began to feel threatened by Luella, Louis B. Mayer decided perhaps the person to challenge her was Hedda Hopper. He saw to it that Hedda Hopper was hired by the Los Angeles Times to run a rival column. And that is really how the rivalry began between Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons. She actually began as a ringer for Luella Parsons. Since Hedda was one of the gang, she was an actress, she knew everybody, she also knew everybody's secrets. So if she needed a few extra bucks, she might just slip a secret or two to Luella. Luella would pay her a little bit and then say, go find some more dirt on somebody else. Well, Hedda started to think, I'm the one who's getting these stories for you. Maybe I should do this too. So she began writing some columns here and there.
Yes, at the world premiere of my very first Hollywood short. Carol Landis, Evelyn Keyes, Jane Withers, and Anne Shirley made personal appearances at the Palace Theater. Joey Brown was the fair-haired boy.
Thank you very kindly, ladies and gentlemen. Really, please, that hurts. I'm just a little embarrassed. I'll swallow one of these darn things.
Eventually, Hedda became just as powerful, if not more so, than Luella Parsons. And Louis B. Mayer is quoted as saying, I tried to get rid of one monster, but I've created two.
We're off to a Hollywood party you didn't hear much about, but it's the sort of party every town in the country should copy. Our stars date their first sweethearts, their mothers, and take them dancing. Here's Frances D. with her mother and mother-in-law, Mrs. McRae. While poor Joel couldn't even get the evening off to chaperone them. Freddie Bartholomew looking like the sophisticated man about town with Fred McMurray. Yes, Freddie's dancing with that great-grandmother, May Robeson, bless her heart. While Fred McMurray twirls with, heavens, there I go again with my big mouth open. Take good care of her, Freddie, while I dash back to the office and bat out my newspaper column. I wonder if our present-day producers realize that we get thousands of fan letters a week asking for information about our old-time favorites.
Hedda was also realized that in order to be successful, she was going to have to outdo Luella. Hedda was much more aggressive. There was nothing that would keep Hedda from getting a story. Hedda broke stories that Luella would not have broken. Hedda realized that in order to get the attention that she needed to be successful, she had to go one step further, maybe be a little less palatable than Luella. Luella always had an air of there was some lines she just wouldn't cross. Hedda ran through those lines. not only crossed them, but blew them out of the way.
I think people remember Luella Parsons today because they remember Hedda and Luella. They remember the cat fights. They remember the idea that these two women personified for quite a long period of time. For the two of them together worked for over 25 years in fighting each other in a way, but fighting against each other. But they personified the idea of humanizing Hollywood, of the power to put people down and to raise people up. And they really were powerful in a almost surreal kind of way. But they're remembered together. You don't hear Hedda without Luella or vice versa.
The biggest premiere in Hollywood history for Warner Brothers' A Star is Born brings out hundreds of film notables, including Danny Thomas and his wife. Movie columnist Hedda Hopper doesn't want to miss this story. And Georgie Jessel, the Toastmaster General, is also attending with the Gary Coopers. Another famous columnist, Luella Parsons, accompanied by Jimmy McHugh. And here's Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. The famous pianist Liberace attends the Technicolor CinemaScope premiere with his mother. The old master Clark Gable is on hand for the big occasion, too. And here's the star of A Star is Born, Judy Garland.
I think most of the studio heads at the time thought, good, finally, we've been kowtowing to Luella for so long, and now we can kind of maybe play one against the other, and let's see, we have some choices here. They almost didn't realize what they were creating, these two women who would rise to such incredible power. But at first, it was very encouraged by the rest of Hollywood that there be two gossip columnists.
No evening would be complete without Hedda Hopper.
Well, I want you to know no evening is complete for me unless I am standing very close to Hedda.
How are
Hedda
you,
Hopper,
darling?
it's a real pleasure to see you here tonight.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I've lost my fellow named Bob.
Where is he?
He got lost in the mob down there.
Well,
There he is.
Gosh,
And
we ought to get him
tonight
up.
is really show business, isn't it?
I think so. It's the
You
biggest.
see, it's the biggest. 5 years ago, Judy lost Anna Get Your Gun, and Betty Hutton got the part. Yesterday, Betty Hutton says that she's going to retire from show business. Now, have you ever heard anything like that in your
Switch
life?
to end all switches.
Yes,
I think.
well,
It's
we've
a
never
Hollywood
known.
story in itself.
Well, we've never known anything like that in Hollywood, have you?
No.
You're looking wonderful. How many children have you?
I have one, honey, and one coming in November. Thank you for mentioning it.
Christmas time in the late 30s, early 40s, when they're both at their peak in a way, Hedda's house at Christmas was almost a joke. She would just laugh and say, look at all this loot. This is just the best thing I ever tripped into. The presents would come by the truckloads from everybody. They were afraid not to give her gifts. I mean, she got a Rolls Royce one year, for God's sake. I mean, she was just rolling in all these presents. Now, she knew that she was getting this loot because of her power, or her perceived power, that people, as she would say, look what fear has brought to my door. They're afraid of me, so they're giving me all this stuff. Luella, on the other hand, I think thought she got all these gifts because people really liked her.
Good evening. My name is Hedda Hopper. This is my first visit to Alaska, and I must say I think it will make a wonderful 49th state.
Pardon me, are you an Eskimo?
Why, no, I'm
Tell me about your igloo. How do you get the wallpaper to stick?
I'm not an Eskimo. I'm a tourist here like yourself.
Oh, really? Say, I'm famished. Do you know the name of a nice tea room around here?
Well, you might try the Last Chance Saloon.
Hey, Duncan Hines recommends it. He recommends you go there with a doctor. How about that? Thank you very much. I think I'll try that. When I get back to the States, I'm going to look you up. What did you say your name was?
Luella Parsons.
Isn't that wonderful? Fine, I'll see you later. I can't wait to get to the Last Chance Saloon to see. Taxi! Taxi!
She got the celebrity as a columnist that she never had as an actress. She took advantage of it. And she frequently played herself in many Hollywood films. She appeared as herself in Sunset Boulevard.
Hedda Hopper speaking. I'm talking from the bedroom of Norma Desmond. Don't bother with a rewrite, man. Take this direct. Ready? As day breaks over the murder house.
Yes, you'll read the big black headlines about Norma Desmond and this Hollywood scandal.
Hedda appeared as herself also in The Women. Well, not really Hedda Hopper, a character based that was like a Roman Clef of Hedda Hopper. Dolly DePeister, who was a columnist, but you knew exactly who she was. And also in several episodes of Lucille Ball's television show, I Love Lucy. And she even appeared as late as the 60s on the Beverly Hillbillies, playing, who else? Hedda Hopper.
Hello, Tom.
Ed, it's awfully nice for you to come over and say hello to us this morning.
I'm so glad to be here.
Pleasure.
And do you know Mrs. Cooper, Gary's mother?
No.
How do you
Hello,
do?
Mrs. Cooper. Gee, it's nice to see you. How's Gary?
Very well, thank you.
Mhm.
And Mrs. LeSurge, Joan Crawford's mother.
Oh, hello, how are you?
you?
Ed, I know that you're famous for daffy hats, but what is that supposed to represent?
Well, when I left home this morning, it was a goldfish bowl.
Ed, I simply have to try it on. Do you mind?
What do you suppose I wore it for?
What ends up happening with Hedda and Luella, and now we're in the late 30s, early 40s, it's like Luella is telling the good news. And Hedda is saying, hey, you want some real dirt? This is what I can tell. Now, which one are you going to read first? You want to know about the dirt, right?
Now take, for instance, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. We think of Hepburn and Tracy as this wonderful, romantic Hollywood couple for decades and decades.
Don't you understand what I mean, Tess? I want to marry you.
But the reality was that Spencer Tracy was a married man, and he was Catholic, with 2 children. And this was basically a decades-long extramarital affair. Well, Luella would not touch that. Hedda, however, had no qualms about running blind items about stars with just enough details so you knew who she was talking about. She did this once and ran a blind item about Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy. And one night at Ciro's, Spencer Tracy saw her and walked up to her and gave her a swift kick in the behind. Now, everybody knew why he was giving her a kick in the behind, and it wasn't a friendly tap either. This happened frequently with Hedda, because Hedda went places Luella would not go. You would never have done that to Luella. You never would have kicked Luella in the butt. But with Hedda, it seemed like it was deserved.
We're honored to have had you in Hedda Hopper's Hollywood.
Hedda could also say things straight out. She began rumors that Cary Grant and Randolph Scott, who for quite a few years shared a Malibu home, were lovers, which had been rumored throughout Hollywood for a very long time, which no one had really ever come out and said.
Many of the stars built big homes further down the beach. That's Cary Grant. Sounds like Cary's having a party.
And leave it to Hedda to come right out in the line and say it. Not too long after that, the studio suggested that perhaps Cary Grant should get married and he and Randolph Scott should go their separate ways.
What do you want? Jordan, I've got a warrant for your arrest. Arrest? You can't arrest me. What's the charge? Bigamy.
Bigamy?
Huh?
Who are you?
Well, you see, Your Honor, he was on the island with her. He's not important to this case.
I'll decide what's important to the case. They were on an island together for 7 years?
Yes, Your Honor.
Not alone.
Yes.
This is how powerful these women were, that they could affect people's personal lives. Grace Kelly reportedly ended an affair with her co-star in Dial M for Murder, Ray Milland, because Hedda found out, and she said, if you don't end this affair, I'm going to expose it and ruin your career. She did it. This is the kind of power these women had.
Hedda thought she was the keeper of the morals. She started to believe her own press clips. She started to believe that she really was this grand inquisitor, keeper of the morals that Hollywood desperately needed somebody to call them on, be it Charlie Chaplin, being with young girls. I mean, what she did, what Hedda Hopper did with Charlie Chaplin now, Lord, I mean, that man had a reputation going on 20 years. But Hedda was the one who promoted the idea. When Joan Barry, this sweet young thing, comes to her and says, well, I'm pregnant and Charlie dropped me and Charlie's the father of this child. And Hedda just, blew the story up and out and told everybody all about it, and that went to trial. And it was very soon proven that Joan Barry's child could not have been Chaplin's through blood tests. Well, that little minor detail never bothered Hedda. You know, this was a man who had just used and abused too many young girls over the years, and Joan Barry was just emblematic of that. So don't bother me with little details like blood tests. I mean, he should be castigated for his conduct, and she was the woman to do it.
Another difference between Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper was that Hedda Hopper was very interested in politics. Luella Parsons did not get political. Luella Parsons was much more interested in what shade Constance Bennett was painting her bathroom than she was in any political issue. Hedda, however, had some powerful friends in some powerful places. One of Hedda's friends was J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI. And she was a spy of sorts for him. She was an arch-conservative, Republican, and rabid anti-communist. She had mentioned to him her dislike for Charlie Chaplin, mostly because Chaplin was, by all accounts, a socialist and very much for the working man, which was something that was just drove Hedda crazy. And J. Edgar Hoover allegedly said to Hedda Hopper, "You get me the goods and we'll get him." And because of Hedda's constant attacks on Chaplin, she really made it very difficult for Chaplin in the late 40s, when the whole anti-communist era was beginning after World War II, to remain in this country. She once famously said that he was the man who came to dinner and stayed for 40 years. Chaplin never took US citizenship, which also really drove Hedda Hopper crazy. She felt that America gave Chaplin his great success, and what a traitor he was not to renounce his British citizenship and become an American citizen. Thus the quote, "the man who came to dinner and stayed for 40 years.
Remember, this is at a time, particularly in the middle 40s, when, communists were under every bed. And some people took that much more seriously than others. Anytime they didn't like somebody, they'd call him a communist. Didn't matter. Hedda writes to J. Edgar, "You've got the ammunition. Pass it on to me, and I'll do the shooting. So tell me whatever you want. Tell me who you want me to get. I'll go after him." Oh my God, well, of course, that's candy to somebody like J. Edgar Hoover. But she ended up shooting at an awful lot of people. And so when you shoot at an awful lot of people, your power is diffused.
Hedda was a rabid anti-communist. She was a huge supporter of Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose House Un-American Activities Committee was formed in the late 40s in order to weed out suspected communists from all kinds of industries. But Hollywood was a major target because of the fact that Hollywood has historically been a liberal town. Artists, the actors, the directors, not necessarily the studio heads, certainly not, but the actors, the writers, the directors are left-leaning people. So Hollywood became a huge target for the House Un-American Activities Committee. Hedda Hopper was a great supporter of Senator McCarthy and very frequently leaked names to him of people she personally, not that she had any information, but that she suspected of being, as she would say, commies, left-leaning Reds, as she would say.
Hedda didn't have to go before the committee to name names. She used her column to name names. And she didn't care, everybody was pink or red or this or that. And she named an awful lot of people, many of whom, people in Hollywood knew simply weren't involved in any real communist or activities. I mean, an awful lot of these people were people who had fought the Nazis, who had fought the fascists. I mean, that was what they were. had nothing to do really with Russia, Stalin, communism at all. It was people who were anti-Mussolini and anti-Hitler. But that all kind of just blurred together for Hedda. She didn't care.
Hedda took this column to new levels, kind of what we see today through the tabloids.
We have this evolution, yes, with Hedda and Luella, starting in the late 30s, going through the 40s, but also remember we have this whole cultural evolution as well. We've got World War II, we have, Roosevelt, we have all these changes in the country in so many ways, and so of course, Hedda and Luella are going to be changing with them. And of course, the main change comes with Hedda once we have the Blacklist and the House of Un-American Activities and her incredible self-righteousness all come together at the same time in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And it brings on an ugliness that has never been in the whole gossip business before.
So Hollywood itself was changing, the studio system was dying. And these two women who were very much part and parcel of that system saw their power begin to wane in the 50s, throughout the 50s. Now, as vicious as Hedda Hopper could be, and as rather malicious as Luella Parsons could be, they were no match for a magazine like Confidential, which came right out and said things people were thinking but wouldn't dare say. So the boundaries definitely got shifted. The envelope got pushed, and the lines that were crossed were lines that Luella and certainly even Hedda would not have crossed. And by the time of Confidential, which leads directly to what we deal with today, from Luella, Hedda, Confidential, into these tabloid rags, which is pretty much all began with Luella and Hedda Hopper.
The closest thing to describe what happened with Confidential is TMZ. It's just like a Molotov cocktail thrown into the middle of what had been this rather bucolic community. Yes, they had their little fights and stuff, but nothing compared to this no rules, no holds barred. We're going to tell these incredible stories, whether they're true or not.
When Confidential magazine came along, the idea was that most of the magazines, and even the ones that were not controlled by big media, they still needed the studios to let them on set. They needed the studios, to like them, so they were always beholden to them. So the world of Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper was completely different than the world that Bob Harrison and Confidential magazine ushered in. This was not an era where in the mainstream media, famous people had genitals. So the idea of them actually having sex and actually having forbidden sex, it was tantalizing. So when Bob started hatching this idea for Confidential, he knew that he would need support. And Walter Winchell was kind of the most famous columnist in the world at the time. Between his radio broadcasts and his syndicated newspaper column, something like 50 million people were reading him or listening to him every day.
Mr. and Mrs. America and all the ships at sea, let's go to the movies. What with the world and its tensions today, the uncertainties and the ever-constant fears, take my advice and go see a movie.
The single most important factor in Confidential becoming successful was likely Walter Winchell promoting it constantly. Bob was smart. He certainly went after some of Walter Winchell's pet causes. If anybody said anything bad about Walter Winchell, there was an article in Confidential magazine that said Winchell was right. Everything he said was right. And it was what guaranteed that the magazine would succeed. In some ways, a lot of these stories were like a game. The Star would release a story, Bob would print the story, there would be a lot of publicity, the Star would say that the story wasn't true, the Star would threaten to have a lawsuit, there would be more headlines, more publicity. It was sort of win-win for everybody. There were times, however, where people really took issue. And Maureen O'Hara, to this day, she is going out of her mind about the fact that Confidential magazine printed a story that she was in the back row of Grauman's Chinese Theater kissing a man. They said that the guy went in wearing a suit, and when the usher came in and saw them, his suit jacket was off and his tie was undone. Oh, the scandal. But she really honestly was pissed off. In 1957, the studios had had enough. There was kind of a war chest they put together of about $500,000. They launched this lawsuit against the magazine, the trial of the century. They realized that what they could charge the magazine with, essentially, what can you charge? Murder, What they could charge them with was libel and obscenity. Well, neither one of those things puts anybody in jail. Those are just, things that you get fines. And neither one of those things is going to put the magazine out of business. So they invented a crime that would be a felony, called criminal conspiracy to commit felony libel. Bob hired some very, very good attorneys. The first thing they did is say, if you're going to say that this magazine prints untrue stories, then we are going to subpoena every single Hollywood star we have ever written about to testify under oath about whether or not these stories were true. Well, it was like the Exodus from Egypt. Stars, they were in international waters, they went to Spain, they went to Mexico, they just left in droves. Because of course, most of the stories were true, but most of the stories were way worse in real life than what Bob actually printed. And that was one of his insurance policies. One of the most famous incidents of Bob holding aside information was a story on Bob Mitchum called The Nude Who Came to Dinner. Robert Mitchum showed up drunk at a costume party and said that he didn't realize that it was a costume party, and it was at Charles Lawton's house. And he drunkenly took off all of his clothes, poured ketchup on himself, and said, "Look at me, I'm a hamburger." Okay, kind of weird, kind of scandalous, but when he threatened to sue, what Bob threatened to reveal in court was that the true story was that it was a party of mainly gay men, and when Bob Mitchum showed up, he actually put the ketchup on his penis and said, "Which one of you fags wants a hot dog?" Okay, maybe we won't go to court. So in the end, they did corral some stars to testify. Tab Hunter, Maureen O'Hara, Dorothy Dandridge, and Liberace, among others. Liberace attesting under oath that he was not a homosexual. Maureen O'Hara testifying under oath that she did not kiss another man in the back row of Grauman's Chinese Theater.
And it shocks me to realize the availability of this magazine and this type of literature on practically every newsstand in the United States.
There is no price that can be placed on a person's reputation.
And I don't think that we can even begin to measure the damage that this type of magazine, this type of literature, does to the minds, the morals, and the behavior.
Mind you, they took a field trip with the jury to Grauman's Chinese, where a big fat guy who was one of the jury members got stuck in the seat trying to figure out if it was possible for Maureen O'Hara and this guy to be kissing each other in the way that the magazine suggested. The tone of the trial was ridiculous, but they failed ever to prove that anything was untrue. But the trial was really, really heavily hyped all over the country. The New York Times wrote about it almost every day for 3 months. The Washington Post wrote about it almost every day for 3 months. It really captured people's imaginations, and people thought that it was about things that mattered. And from Bob's standpoint, you know, the golden goose was kind of dying anyway. He created a marketplace for this kind of scandal magazine. By 1957, when the trial came, there were some 20 or 30 publications with names like The Lowdown and Exposed and Hush Hush and Top Secret, all of these magazines covering all the same stories. So their kind of corner on the market was going away anyway.
So what we have today, the era of TMZ, the era of stories such, but shows are a direct link to what began with Luella Parsons, to Head Up Hopper, to Confidential magazine. You can see the line as it shifts down from Luella to Hedda, to Confidential, to the National Enquirer, to Star, to TMZ, what we deal with today, where actually it seems like there are no holds barred whatsoever. Anything is fair game for reporting. And in those days, with Hedda and Luella, there were things they wouldn't talk about. And that's gone today. Anyone's fair game and anything is fair game. But you can trace the beginnings right back to those two women.
Good night. I'll be seeing you again soon, I hope, in Heather Hopper's Hollywood.